who face eternity easily forget what a lifetime means, what an ending means.
You know it doesn't have to be this way.
No, Kunavine, it does. They need me.
We're 2 weeks in! Welcome to End of Dragons Daily 14. Well, 2 weeks kind of. I mean, yesterday because we did 2 in one day. We're sort of a little bit ahead there. But anyway, I hope you guys are all doing good. Today we'll be talking about Endgame, and I want to make a few clarifications as well, particularly to a comment I made yesterday, which I'm really ashamed of. I committed like the cardinal sin, in my opinion. I did something yesterday that I usually jump down people's throats for, or at least always try to nicely correct people. I took a vague statement from ArenaNet as a promise, and I acted as though they'd promised something when they hadn't. What am I talking about? Well, Super Adventure Box, and Nick last name here. A couple of you guys actually said this. Just to clarify, they never said World 3 would be in 2021 for Super Adventure Box. They even said, and here's the quote, that it may not be next year or even the next, but we are slowly working on things. So yeah, let me take that back. I made a mistake yesterday. I shouldn't have done it. I somehow got into the headspace of thinking World 3 would really be 2021. But those more intelligent or patient of us will have known and maybe always have been expecting something in 2022 or beyond. And you know, this is actually kind of nice because we've been talking a little bit about End of Dragons, but also what's after. Do we really believe in a Season 6 and all that kind of stuff? Well, look, I think that there is something on the table for post-End of Dragons, World 3 SAB. There was another thing I wanted to respond to as well. Now, I won't put this commenter up on screen today. I don't really think you guys witch hunt or anything like that, but it's probably good practice, as has been pointed out to me several times in the past. But someone came out with this crazy comment that because of all the discussion we did over the past 3 videos about the Guild Chat news, which you might take of as bad news, and all the stuff we talked about with Guild Wars 3, and the prospect of the end of Guild Wars 2, they said that, like, that was bad commentary, that I was wearing my burnout with the game on the videos, and that I shouldn't do that, that the videos are meant to be exciting and not really kind of touch on these downery subjects, I suppose. I just want to say, I'm not burnt out from Guild Wars 2 at all. In fact, since Christmas, I played way more Guild Wars 2 these past few weeks than I did for a lot of the second half of last year. I'm not burnt out even remotely. A lot of that's actually because I've had goals again. These past few months, I gave myself the goal of going full legendary. You guys will see a video on that soon, and that's really flourished into a lot of playtime. And I'm very excited about End of Dragons. It's just that, you know, that news kind of had that more slightly negative slant, perhaps, and these are interesting topics to me. So I'll talk about them. I'm not going to hide away, and I'm not going to fluff things up. I never have. I mean, honesty has always been something I felt's important. If it's interesting on my mind, I'm going to talk about it, whether it's to Guild Wars 2's credit or not. I just want to keep things generally about End of Dragons, and if there are things we're worried about with End of Dragons, if there are things we're excited about with End of Dragons, then they'll come out. I think maybe I might have given the wrong impression a little, because obviously it was a lot of discussion in a row. But, you know, I have no problem with that. On balance, I'm still very excited and very happy with Guild Wars 2. I'm more than capable of spending hours and hours, if I wanted, looking at the doom and gloom subjects, while still being firmly seated and understanding where I feel broadly. And I hope everyone else is. But, you know, over the years, I've noticed it really feels like some people struggle with that. They struggle to really talk about the bad for a long time, but maintain perspective that the entire picture is still a positive one. I would really urge anyone in that position, and it's probably hard to identify that within ourselves, to just know it doesn't have to be all or nothing, you know. There are downsides to even our favorite things in the world. Alright, so let's get some discussion for Endgame. I'll open up with Inks, who's left a lot of great comments I've been very happy to see over the past few days. He says, okay, let's be optimistic. I won't point out the faults and feelings of the Endgame past. It would seem the Dragon response missions are where ArenaNet is heading for now. First batch, not so good. Second batch, much better. So now we know that DRMs can work and can be better. Let's hope for that. Whatever they do, they need to make sure the content is repeatable and there for launch or near launch 2 weeks after, so that when you're done with story and map stuff, you have something to do so people don't move on to another game. So DRMs, I think, are an amazing topic for End of Dragons. because a lot of people will see them as a full-on function of endgame now, because they feel like they replaced strike missions. You know, they're both mission types that came in with Icebrood Saga, and as soon as we started getting DRMs, the strikes went away. And you can look at strikes as a replacement for raids, because as soon as we start getting strikes, which feel raidish, the raids went away. You can look at it as this daisy chain, and then therefore it seems that will be some endgame. But I kind of want to put in the expansion, but I kind of want to propose an alternate world where maybe they won't do Dragon response missions at all in End of Dragons. With the most recent news, it kind of looks like, to me, Dragon response missions were conceived, intelligently conceived, but nonetheless as kind of a Hail Mary, desperation-like compromise approach that, again, allows them to get good, repeatable content out so that the team can shift over to the expansion. So in that context, it's like, well, why would they continue with Dragon response missions after they've done End of Dragons? They're just here to sort of pave over the gap, aren't they? Maybe they're just a stopgap measure, something temporary we won't see again. You know, after all, DRMs don't have their own area in LFG. Strike missions have their own area in LFG, but not DRMs. So maybe they'd ignore it. That's one thought. I have another thought too, and again, it's on the idea that they won't actually be a part of Endgame. Now, for what it's worth, don't get me wrong, I can acknowledge that maybe they will be there for Endgame. But here's a third idea, that they do continue with them, but that's just what they do for personal story instances now. And if you watch my coverage with the first batch of DRMs, you'll know why I'm saying this. It's because I actually think that it's just a really strong concept for how story could be delivered going forwards. You know, this to me is like an advanced, new version of a personal story instance. It's just better, and in terms of replayability and getting other people along with you, this works well. So, you know, think about Path of Fire or Heart of Thorns. You could break those down into the region of, what, 10 to 15 DRMs? You know, just basically take each instance and reconfigure them as a DRM. So maybe End of Dragons can learn from what has been created here for the second half of the Icebrood Saga. Maybe they can inform one another. I mean, hell, if ArenaNet had been really sneaky, maybe they'd always planned to do this format of Dragon response missions for End of Dragons, and, you know, it's actually the Icebrood Saga that's borrowing from End of Dragons development, and we just didn't know it yet. Overall, I must say, if I had to choose between DRM strikes, dungeons, fractals, raids, DRMs probably are at the bottom of my list for an actual function of Endgame, so I hope ArenaNet don't do it, but I could see that maybe. It depends if the expansion itself is kind of crunched, no? Jordan says, I've been thinking about the development of the expansion. You mentioned that you think it started development shortly after Visions of the Past. If I remember correctly, the expansion actually got announced shortly before the Visions of the Past release, so that means the latest expansion has been in development since February and March of 2020, or possibly earlier. I just felt it interesting to compare that to POH, I think you mean Path of Fire, right? Which didn't properly start development until the release in the spring 2016 update, which came out in April. Assuming End of Dragons gets an August to September release date, then that means this expansion has had a slightly longer development time than POF. I just wonder what that means in terms of scope for the expansion. Can we expect as many maps as we got in POF in terms of quantity and size, or due to COVID and working from home, should we expect something more on the scale of Heart of Thorns? Just felt something interesting to think about. Well, it certainly is. To your original comment, remember that when they developed Visions of the Past, it was long before it got revealed. So even though we in the community saw the teaser for End of Dragons before the release actually came out, that doesn't still mean what I said yesterday isn't true. They could have made it, and then, oh god, we're doing an expansion, and then a trailer gets developed, and the community just sees it slightly out of order, right? Which is what I'm thinking would have happened. As for the scope of End of Dragons, naturally, I think we're all inclined to want it to be as big as possible. So, you know, yeah, you can say, look, there's this huge gap. They've been working for a long time. They've even pulled all the Living World people over, so there's even more work that they can do. You can look at it that way, or you can look at them as being in a position of crisis. You can point out that there are way less devs at the studio now than when those other expansions were in development. And again, we don't know the proportions of who was on what, so it's very, very difficult to say in the community. If they are going for Guild Wars 2 long-term, forever and always, I think the absolute most essential thing that End of Dragons needs is an entry point for new blood, an entry point for new players. And what does that mean? A new leveling environment. I've seen a few comments from you guys about this. Obviously, it's kind of the opposite of today's topic on endgame, but I really do think that's crucial because you've got to expand the audience somehow. And of course, that takes the form in my mind of a playable Tengu race. And when we talk about stuff like that, that takes a lot of work and a lot of time. And this is, you know, where the scope suddenly expands massively. So I really hope that. Something interesting to think about is the End of Dragons may be the first expansion developed where the studio philosophy is to really support Guild Wars 2 long term. What do I mean by that? Well, when they finally decided to do Heart of Thorns, they still had ambitions largely for other games and were developing other games that we never saw. Same was true with Path of Fire. They were doing other stuff we never saw. And now with End of Dragons, since the layoffs, maybe the perspective is different for the first time ever. And so there's other stuff, not just like the idea of new entry point for other players, but you've got to look at some of the systems long term. And I don't just mean core Tyria and all the stuff that's broken there, but like elite specializations. They're doing another 9 right now. And then what are they going to do? Commit to another expansion after End of Dragons for 2 years later? Then they have to go on another 9. They're going to run out of inspiration in the end. And I kind of think that at some point they'll say, well, look, the elite specialization system had a good run. It went from 2014 to 2023. But now, during the End of Dragons era, we really can't push it any further. So let's retool the whole thing. And you might see a big change. And not just with elite specializations, where they completely change like the way the buildcraft and stuff works. You could see big changes like that in several areas of Guild Wars 2. Because that's what it's going to need to stay contemporary and to have meaning and to really, really bat and grow over the next decade. If End of Dragons, however, is just kind of like an ending point and will function as an announcement for a whole new project, then they kind of don't need to have such a big scope at all. They just need to do what they want to do well and call it an ending. Like, if you are closing curtains, and again, I don't mean to go on about this too much, do you really need to completely overhaul the underwater combat system, as some people might have been asking for? Do you really need to look at racial skills and whether they're being fully utilized? Do you really need to look at Edge of the Mists and the fact that it's dead and nobody's there? You guys might have noticed in the footage from a previous video. Maybe stuff like that doesn't matter, you know? Matt Jantz says, I'm hoping we see the return of alliance battles in some form. Maybe not between the Luxons and Kurziks, but between other factions within Cantha, such as the Ministry of Purity, and a faction wanting to open Cantha up to the broader world. A hybrid Luxon-Kurzik faction versus people in the city, or people who worship the dragons and those who are against them, and we as players choose sides. Endgame content that plays into the faction side would be great. It's funny as you say this, because it makes me think of the whole Primordus v Jormag thing in the Icebreed Saga and how that's kind of appropriate. Look, this was a big part of Endgame for the factions campaign, and last time we were at Cantha, you know, alliance battles and stuff really was a prominent part. But I wonder whether I'm really that excited about this anymore. I appreciate other people's enthusiasms, and the idea of changing the factions up is kind of a cool one. But I think the reason why I got so invested into Luxons versus Kurziks was because the whole thing was built around that. You know, at several points in the story, that was a big deal. And, you know, they had very, very distinct aesthetics, a whole area of the world that each belonged to. And everything about each faction seemed opposite to the other. Each of them had like a big iconic beast associated with them, like the Siege Turtle and the Juggernaut. Like, at so many layers, there was something to invest in about your team. If now it's just like, oh, I'm from the city and I want to speak to outsiders, and I'm from the city and I don't want to speak to outsiders, suddenly I feel like a lot of that's stripped away and I'm a little bit less excited. Not to say they couldn't introduce a ton of new world building that makes me enthusiastic, but I just kind of think, maybe this is because I'm such a Guild Wars oneer, but I kind of feel like let's stick it with the Kurziks and Luxons, right? I don't know, maybe that's inobjective of me. Connor says, by the way, it still weirds me out in this new age of the internet where everyone just has their IRL name as their handle and that's it, no matter where they're posting. I'm from a generation where we were told that you should never have your real details online, and it's interesting how the proportion has crept and changed. Anyway, Connor says, for Endgame, I really want some solo competitive things. Part of what deters me from raids and dungeons, etc. is having to find 4 to 9 other players and hoping that they know the content or at least receptive to an explanation. Mini games and side content are lacking in my opinion. We need a card game, battle pets, etc. Ideally with compelling incentives beyond AP. Belcher's Bluff and Mount races have too few rewards and are moderately inaccessible due to weird skill curves. Imagine Imagine playing Tyrion Gwent with your guildie in front of your framed Black Lion armory. I'd never leave. Yeah, these are all really interesting, frivolous extras, I think, to that second paragraph. I mean, there's a big part of me that wants to see Guild Wars 2 fully realize everything it ever attempted. So when I see, like, the Polymock arena that is still unfinished over in Ratasum, I think, well, you got to do it. And when I see the mini-pet arena in Lion's Arch that actually, you know, looks a bit like the ArenaNet logo, I think, well, you've got to do it. And when I think about the early activities that they announced, like Archery Shootout in Divinity's Reach, I think you've got to do it. This game isn't done until this stuff's there. But I wonder whether that's foolish, you know. At some point, you do have to cut things away and just accept that they won't be there. Guild Wars doesn't seem to have ever really had any deep ambition for stuff like this. Belcher's Bluff is a great example because it's very close, but it really needed a lot more work and exposure to be played a lot amongst the community. So now it's like this almost like weird trivia piece, a very minor part of the game. And even stuff like the golem battles you could play in Metrica Province at launch that ended up getting cut away, and now there's just one place in Heart of Thorns you can still do it. They just don't seem to prioritize that stuff. And honestly, I can kind of see why. Like, if one of the big aspects of End of Dragons is that it's slated to add 5 or 6 of these things, I don't know whether I'm that happy to hear about it when there's so many other elements of the game that I think maybe they could focus on first. Features like this, to me, I think really thrive and shine at an MMO launch, or if they're there for like the full length of the game. And yeah, I mean, if we could have this as a big part of the experience for the next 10 years of Guild Wars 2, nice. But do I want them to spend expansion time on it? I'd rather they just filter in and really honor it as Living World goes out, maybe. Going to this idea of solo stuff for Endgame. Yeah, I agree, finding 9 other people absolutely sucks. I think that the decision to implement 10-man raiding was awful from ArenaNet. I still think that a lot of that stuff can be retroactively changed. I think the 4 players is fine. A 4 or 5 party man size I think is good, and any good MMO needs to have these social moments and content for people to do like that. So I would pick that over solo stuff, but people do like the solo things. Look at the Crown Pavilion at its original release and original balance. There was actually another comment on yesterday's video, I don't have it on screen for you guys, but someone was talking about how fun they found an Elder Scrolls Online endgame feature, which again was a solo thing. I kind of resist a little bit how much Guild Wars 2 already goes solo. Like, I view the open world as constantly caring about solo. I view all of the personal story as constantly caring about solo. And I sort of feel like that's enough, you know. Those are 2 massive faces of the game that you can do solo, and are even, to a large degree, repeatable, interesting experiences that you can have. So let's have endgame stuff continue to be team stuff. And the main value there is endgame as in repeatable, right? That's what we'll be doing over and over again. If you have that be the community stuff, then that encourages the use of guilds and friends lists and all these other things that make the game a worthwhile social platform. And that is where the real staying power comes from with a lot of MMOs. Lastly, we have Yahweh. I'm going to pronounce you as the Abrahamic god. I would very much like to see strikes in End of Dragons. If ArenaNet implements several side stories the way they did in 3 and 4, those side stories could conclude in new strikes unlocking. I would like to see at least 2 of the Forging Steel-like experiences. This dungeon/strike mixture, one could have regular boss like the Whisper of Jormag, and the other prop boss to keep things fresh. Raids and fractals are also very important. I really hope that at least 3 raid wings over the course of time, and at least 4 different fractals dealing with some events from Canthan Past. So I really like this take. I think we'll have to have another part on Endgame, guys, because there's so much we can say. For fractals, to me, it's not actually about new islands. It's about the system. Like, I would actually really like to see either a rebalancing of the current tiers or the implementation of a tier 5. And I would like to see more instabilities and more varied random experiences that can occur within there. I think there are enough islands to keep it varied. Of course, having new islands is great, and I would like to see that. I would like to see a unique island for every rung on our way up, you know. It's just that you've got T1, T2, T3, T4. But I don't think it's essential. And particularly, I don't think it's essential at the launch of the X-Pack. And yeah, let's talk about strikes. I like this. What you've kind of suggested makes me now think, and in combination with our previous question, what if the personal story format was DRMs, and they kind of ended up introducing you to bosses that you could then repeatedly fight in strikes? I actually, guys, have become a very big fan of strikes, I must say. I think with a little bit cleaner economy behind it and reward systems behind it, maybe a little bit easier with LFG, if I could chain strike islands back to back to back instead of having to bounce in and out of a hub, I think I could really, really get into them. Something about the quick, fast foody, junky, like nature of those bosses, if they were just tuned better, if the participation rewards for beating it under certain time thresholds and so on was recalibrated, I think that could be great. Like, I look at the Bone Skinner encounter as it currently is, as a little like Gorseval. It's actually an amazing fight with lots of interesting moving pieces, but people just DPS past it and ignore it. And that's because of ArenaNet not tuning them properly. They're so close to having very, very, very good stuff here. I would even be an advocate, and people might think this is crazy, but for killing raids, taking everything we know from current raid wings and just split them into multiple strikes. So take like the first wing of the Spirit Veil, and now instead there's a VG strike, there's a Gorseval strike, there's a Sabbather strike. And, you know, maybe the pre-events are attached or maybe they're not, but you kind of just have it all as strikes. And then you could keep the raids themselves that kind of tell the long form story if you want. But, you know, put them into these little digestible islands, throw them into some good infrastructure, and now End of Dragons can implement some other ones as well. That would be really, really good. I think they're sitting on a potential gold mine here. I just don't know whether the devs themselves see it. It's hard because people think they've moved on from strikes because they didn't like them or because the player base wasn't engaging with them enough. But fear not, it really just looks like it's because they couldn't dev for the Icebrood Saga too much more, and that leaves them wide open and in play for End of Dragons itself. So there you go, guys. That's End of Dragons Daily for today. Thank you so much for engaging. Continue to drop your comments down below. It's embarrassing how many of them I'm reading and constantly just refreshing my YouTube feed. And, you know, at the end of so many of these videos, I've said, oh, share it, tell other people about it. You know what? I actually think yesterday, one of the videos it had higher viewership than I would have expected, which is good. That's a natural sign that the series might be growing a bit. So that's so positive and brilliant to me, and I hope we continue in that direction. So thank you guys, really a heartfelt thank you, and I will see you tomorrow for even more. Oh, by the way, yeah, the music was a bit loud yesterday. I'll make sure it's a bit quieter today. I know some of you guys have sensitive ears. See you soon.